Welcome to this webinar. This is Sophia Asan of the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition. We're so glad that you could join us today for this webinar that is co-hosted by the Contraceptive Technology Innovation Exchange, the Hormonal IUD Access Group, and the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition. Kindly keep yourselves muted unless you're speaking to the full group. You can enter your questions or comments in the chat at any time. We will have a Q&A portion at the near the end of the webinar, and questions will be addressed as time allows. Also, feel free if you would like to introduce yourselves by your name and organization in the chat box. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Kate Rademacher of FHI 360.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited about this event. Just briefly, my name is Kate Rademacher. I'm a Senior Technical Advisor at FHI 360, and I serve as the Project Director for the LEAP initiative, which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and which funded this work that we'll be talking about today. So what are we focusing on? We're going to hear about recent efforts led by Impact RH360, WCG Cares, and FHI 360 to develop a harmonized labeling strategy for the hormonal IUD Avibela. Our hope is that the insights from this assessment may be helpful for suppliers and procurers and others seeking to harmonize labeling for global health products. So this includes family planning, but I think that the findings today are going to be relevant for additional products in the global health space. So hopefully it'll be relevant to you. We'll do our best to reserve the last 10 or 15 minutes of the hour for Q&A. So please feel free to enter your questions at any point in the chat. We may try to respond to them in writing, but we'll save some time for verbal discussion as well. And when we get to the Q&A section, you can also raise your hand and come off mute. And as Sophia said, please keep yourself muted in the meantime. Next slide. So we'd like to just start off with a poll so we know who's in the room. If you can go ahead and maybe we can launch the poll. How do you define the organization you're from? Are you a pharmaceutical manufacturer, procurer, donor? Are those seeing the chat? I'm not seeing it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just briefly, if you can say what kind of organization you're from. Great. More seconds. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just not seeing an option to enter.
I think it might be because you're a presenter, Kelly.
I see. Got it. Thank you.
Oh, actually, no, that's true. I don't think anybody's done it yet. Are we getting responses? Oh, we're only seeing the poll results.
Cannot enter answers, Kate.
I'm sorry?
We cannot enter the answer.
Yeah, so I think that's
We're getting the results, and
okay.
But not the question.
Thank you. So Monique, I don't know, maybe for the interest of time, we can move on for this poll, but maybe for the next poll. So I'd say what we could do instead is why don't people go ahead and introduce themselves in the chat. If you feel comfortable, you can put your name and organization, and perhaps if it's not clear what kind of organization it is. Thank you. Next slide. And you can, for those, everybody can maybe just close the screen manually on your end if you need to. All right, so just briefly, I'm gonna talk about this and then we'll move forward. What do we mean by harmonized labeling and why is it important? Harmonized labeling refers to the use of identical product labeling across multiple countries. Harmonized labeling is important because it can create time and cost efficiencies that benefit stakeholders across the value chain, which we'll be exploring more in detail later. Before we get to more about what is harmonized labeling and why it's important, I'd like to hand it off to Tina, who's the CEO of Medicines 360, and she's going to provide a bit more background on the hormonal IUD and specifically on Impact RH360's hormonal IUD product, Avibela, before we dive into the broader discussion about the harmonized labeling assessment. Thanks so much. Tina?
Thanks, Kate. I'm happy to be here to share our experience with harmonized labeling. So I'm Tina Rain Bennett, the CEO of Medicines 360. And I just want to go through the timeline for the hormonal IUD. So the first hormonal IUD was developed by the Population Council and was first approved in Finland in 1990 and marketed by Bayer as Mirena. Mirena was then approved in the US in 2000. Since then, use of the hormonal IUD has steadily grown, leading to a revitalization of the IUD market. Unfortunately, however, the hormonal IUD has not been available at scale in any former Family Planning 2020 focus countries, largely due to the high upfront cost of the innovator product. In 2003, Bayer and the Population Council established the International Contraceptive Access Foundation to provide local service delivery organizations in low and middle income countries with the hormonal IUD on a not-for-profit basis. To date, the ICI Foundation has donated more than 180,000 hormonal IUDs. In 2015, Medicines 360 received stringent regulatory approval of a hormonal IUD. The relatively low cost of this product created momentum around the consideration of the hormonal IUD as a viable contraceptive option for women in low and middle income countries. And the USAID convened a global working group to evaluate the potential to expand access to the method in low and middle income countries. In the same year, the World Health Organization added the hormonal IUD to the Model Essential Medicines list and released an expression of interest for WHO pre-qualification. The newly formed working group developed a global learning agenda for the hormonal IUD. Its members conducted 8 pilot studies from 2017 to 2020. The results showed an unmet need for the hormonal IUD, as well as high user satisfaction and continuation rates. In 2020, this group, now called the Hormonal IUD Access Group, began supporting the acceleration of hormonal IUD introduction in low and middle income countries, including developing a global forecast for hormonal IUD demand and scale up in low and middle income countries. In 2021, international procurement agencies added the 2 hormonal IUD products, Avibela and Mirena, to their product catalogs. Next slide. I'm just going to share a little bit of more background on the timeline to our experience with harmonized labeling. So in 2009, Medicines 360, a nonprofit pharmaceutical organization, was founded to bring an affordable hormonal IUD to market in the US. Medicines 360 sourced a 52 milligram hormonal IUD in development in Europe and conducted a large phase 3 clinical trial in the US. This product, under the brand name Leaflet, was initially approved by the US Food and Drug Administration in 2015 for contraception for up to 3 years. The product has received subsequent US FDA approvals for up to 6 years of use. In 2014, Medicines 360 created Impact RH360, a wholly owned subsidiary, to focus on introducing its hormonal IUD in low and middle income countries. Impact RH360 began efforts to register Avibela in 2015. Next slide. As you can see here, at the time of this presentation, Avibela is approved in 6 sub-Saharan African countries with additional approvals pending. Now that Avibela is in international procurement agency catalogs, Impact RH360 is accelerating registration activities. Impact RH360 works with global NGOs and pharmaceutical companies with local infrastructure to make the product available to women who want it. As the number of Avibela registrations orders grew, the country-specific labeling, coupled with a small average order size, resulted in multiple inefficiencies. When the Impact RH360 team started exploring harmonized labeling across multiple markets, we realized that many pharmaceutical companies used harmonized labeling, particularly when supplying global procurers. But there was no publicly available information about how they were able to secure regulatory agency approval of labels that differed from country-specific guidelines. Now, I'll hand it over to Kelly to talk a bit about the case for harmonized labeling. Next slide.
Thank you, Tina. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly DiNucci, and I'm the Senior Manager of Global Access at Medicines 360 and Impact RH360. First, I'm going to walk through the benefits of harmonized labeling, as you can see on this slide. So when suppliers seek to market a product in a country, they must first receive authorization from the local regulatory authority. And typically that agency publishes specific guidelines outlining the requirements for regulatory submission, including requirements for pharmaceutical product labeling that varies in content and format across different markets. Harmonizing product labeling can create time and cost efficiencies that benefit stakeholders across the value chain. And these efficiencies result from shorter lead times for producing and supplying product due to the reductions in human and material resource requirements for label creation, printing, and packaging, since the same label is used for multiple countries. It also allows for more flexibility in the supply chain, so manufacturers, procurers, and distributors can deploy the same stock to multiple countries. Harmonizing labeling may also decrease the risk of labeling inconsistency and errors and reduce wastage, as some packaging printers require minimum order quantities, which can be challenging to achieve with specific country-specific labeling, especially during the early stages of product introduction, such as is the case for the hormonal IUD currently. And also, international procurement agencies prefer that products are supplied with harmonized and even multi-language labeling if possible. So despite some of these clear benefits to harmonized labeling, there is limited publicly available information, as Tina mentioned, and so that particular challenge was the impetus of the work that we're actually presenting today. So requirements for country-specific variable information make label harmonization challenging. One element of labeling that the team believed would pose a particular challenge to harmonization is the pharmacovigilance reporting information, which is related to the process through which healthcare providers and patients can report suspected adverse drug reactions. Typically, local regulatory authorities request that the label include local contact information for the manufacturer's technical representative or distributor in country. We'll discuss other country-specific information later in the presentation. When a supplier makes changes to a product's approval, local regulators also must typically approve any resulting label changes, which represents an additional challenge to harmonization. Since review timelines can vary significantly by country, even a previously harmonized label may no longer be identical across relevant countries for extended periods of time. Now I'll pass it off to Emily to dive into the details of the labeling for Avibela.
Kelly. My name is Emily Morris, and I am the Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs at Medicines 360 and Impact RH360. And before we talk about the labeling components for Avibela, we'd like to do another poll to understand what you think about when you hear the phrase regulated product labeling. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen in a moment. Please select the response that best fits with your understanding of which labeling components are regulated by regulatory agencies. And if it doesn't work, we'll just move right through it.
I'm not seeing the poll. Are other, Sophia, are you seeing it?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I can just speak to the poll.
Oh, there it is.
There we go.
But I think it's still the result version, unfortunately, like last time.
Okay. So feel
So it
free to
works.
enter it in the chat what your feedback
I think
is.
it's working. Looks like it's working. Sorry, Emily.
Perfect.
Great. Audrey says it looks fine. Okay, it's working.
We'll give you a moment. Great. So what we're seeing is a lot of you are identifying all 4 labeling components as part of regulated product labeling. So I think we can close the poll shortly. Great, thank you. So as you'll see, we consider all of these labeling components that were listed in the poll as part of our project scope. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll walk through the Avibela labeling that was initially approved in Madagascar to introduce the labeling components for the product and to help illustrate the country-specific variable information that makes labeling harmonization difficult. The first level of labeling for Avibela is the pouch label, which is affixed to the primary packaging, which is a pouch containing the IUD and the inserter. As you can see in this example, the first version of the pouch label approved by the regulatory authority in Madagascar contained country-specific variable information as it relates to the distributor information and the logos. Next slide. An insert with a summary of product characteristics and prescribing information, also known as the SMPC, is included inside the unit carton. The SMPC is for the healthcare provider, and it contains instructions for use, including the insertion and removal instructions. So as you can see in this example, the first version of the SMPC approved by the regulatory authority in Madagascar contained country-specific variable information as it relates to the distributor information and local contact information for pharmacovigilance or adverse event reporting. Next slide. A patient information leaflet is also included inside the unit carton. The patient information leaflet is for the patient who uses Avibela. It contains instructions for use, including what to expect when using the product, bleeding patterns, and common side effects. The leaflet consists of 2 labeling components: the cover artwork, which you can see at the top of the slide, and the leaflet text, which you can see at the bottom. For the purposes of this webinar, we refer to them as a single component. As you can see in this example, the first version of the patient information leaflet approved by the regulatory authority in Madagascar contained country-specific variable information as it relates to the distributor information, logos, and local contact information for pharmacovigilance or adverse event reporting. Next slide. The outermost labeling component is the unit carton, which contains the pouch, the SMPC, and the patient information leaflet. As you can see in this example, the first version of the unit carton approved by the regulatory authority in Madagascar contained country-specific variable information as it relates to the distributor logos. Next slide. So these were the labeling components for Avibela that were assessed for harmonization in 2021. The project comprised of 3 main stages. First, the team conducted extensive desk research on the labeling requirements in 19 countries. As a note, in 2 of these countries, guidelines were not available. The 19 countries were selected based on current or pending Avibela registrations, as well as those countries which Impact RH360 has prioritized for registration. Following the desk research, the team conducted 12 interviews with various stakeholders, including procurement agencies and donors, manufacturers of similar products, and independent global regulatory organizations. At the start of this project, the why of harmonization of labeling was clear. And in these interviews, the team primarily wanted to focus on how harmonized labeling has been achieved for similar products. As a result, interviews with other suppliers and manufacturers were particularly instrumental in developing the harmonized labeling strategy for Avibela. In addition, the project team also gathered examples of existing harmonized labeling for similar products, including Implanon, Nexplanon, Levoplant, Jadel, and Mirena. This helped the team understand the precedent for approval of harmonized labeling by specific regulatory authorities and the harmonization strategy pursued by other suppliers. Finally, Impact RH360 incorporated the learnings from the desk research and the stakeholder interviews into a strategy for harmonized labeling for Avibela. We prepared the labeling and submitted it via a post-approval variation in Madagascar and in Kenya. So now I'll turn it over to Wilberto, who will review some of our key findings.
Thanks, Emily. Next, okay. So my name is Gilberto Robles. I am the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance for WCG Cares, and we collaborated with Medicines 360 and the rest of the team in this assessment. So here, as you can see, this is a summary of the key findings from our desk research and interviews with the stakeholders. And based on that, we found that some level of harmonization is possible for most of the countries assessed. While label harmonization requires negotiation with individual regulators, manufacturers generally do not believe there is an advantage to proactively engage with regulators about labeling guidelines. Example, before submissions of revise the label. While international procurement agencies prefer multi-language harmonized labeling, other products have been procured in large volumes with single language harmonized labeling. The approved harmonized labeling of similar products sometimes differs from the guidelines published by the regulators, which is very common. And in discussions with the regulators, it is crucial to have a clear value proposition for the product. And regulators are more willing to make allowances for products that are readily available, inexpensive, and responds to critical health needs, as expected. Global contract information for pharmacovigilance reporting appears to be acceptable to regulators and procurers instead of providing local contact information, which is a huge finding in the harmonization of labeling across the board. Next slide, please. So the team compiled labeling requirements for 19 countries, as Emily said, of the selected countries with a particular focus on country-specific variable information and local language requirements, as these are the main barriers to label harmonization. Country-specific information includes the marketing authorization holder, local registration number, date of the first authorization, and renewal locally, registration number in the country of origin, a scheduling status, requirement for the generic name to be more prominent on the label than the trade name, contract information for pharmacovigilance reporting, and various formatting requirements in general. Across the countries assessed, 7 different languages were required. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'd like to summarize the key learnings from our stakeholder interviews. Harmonization labeling is preferred by all stakeholders. It increases efficiency by reducing lead times and costs. Some suppliers allow distributor requests for specific packaging for the private sector, but the cost of producing the specialized labeling is passed to the purchaser. Procurers are in ongoing discussions with manufacturers and regulators to encourage consolidation of labeling requirements, and noted that it is also important to engage with the medicines regulatory harmonization initiatives at some point. However, achieving and maintaining harmonized labeling across many markets is complex and resource intensive over harmonization, basically, or having too many countries under the same SKU can result in diminishing returns. Manufacturers do not believe there is an advantage to proactively engagement with the regulatory authorities, but do believe a strong value proposition is needed to advance regulatory approval of standard label. The country-specific variable data requirements that make label harmonization difficult were put in place by local regulators under advertisement of the WHO to reduce the risk of fraudulent or diverted product making its way into the market. And this risk must be considered in the harmonization efforts. Pharmacovigilance reporting contact information does not, in fact, represent a significant barrier to local harmonization, as they already present for the acceptability of global versus local contact information, which is a huge benefit for these purposes. And finally, WHO pre-qualification of products is helpful for harmonization, as local regulators regularly or generally accept the standard labeling approved by the WHO. Now I will pass it off to Mark to talk about the labeling harmonization strategy that was developed for Avibela.
Hello, my name is Mark Bush. I'm a Senior VP of QA and Product Safety at Medicines 360 and Impact RH360. I'd like to briefly describe how we've begun implementation of the labeling harmonization plan for Avibela. And in the short term, Impact RH360 plans to implement single language harmonized labeling for Avibela. This does not require the manufacturer to validate new sizes for multilingual labeling components, and it does allow Avibela to achieve some level of harmonization with the resulting economies in the relative short term. In the longer term, we'll explore the potential for multi-language harmonized labeling. This would require some redesign of artwork and validation of new labeling sizes for some components, and would be aligned with future label updates. So this would potentially allow Avibela to achieve further harmonization. Next slide, please. As an example of the harmonization plan, Avibela is currently distributed in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. With the initial implementation of our harmonized labeling strategy, the total number of unique labeling components across these markets was reduced by 50%, from 16 unique components to 8 unique components. If we could move to the next slide. So one issue in harmonization that we needed to address, and that has already been mentioned, was adverse event reporting. And typically each country specific SMPC for Avibela countries contains local contact information for adverse event or pharmacovigilance reporting, thus making it a unique component. Based on the learnings from this initiative, we've built a web page, and it's shown in the right panel of the slide here. And it's available at Avibela PV with multiple extensions, .net, .com, and .org. And this website includes the current contact information for the reporting of adverse events, including all local distributors and local technical representatives for each country where Avibela is distributed. The web page also includes the adverse event contact information for the local regulatory authority in each country. And if we could move to the next slide. To facilitate access to that web page, what we've done is we've created a QR code which opens the PV information web page upon being scanned by a smartphone. And if you want to try scanning this QR code with your phone, it will take you to that Avibela web page with the contact information. So the QR code would be printed in the harmonized SMPC or equivalent labeling document to be used in to access adverse reporting contact information on the website. So the QR code is an innovative and novel approach that has been submitted to multiple regulatory authorities and is approved in Madagascar and Kenya. The key advantage to this is that in order to add or update adverse event reporting contact information, the labeling does not need to be revised or reprinted. Only the website information gets updated in order to get that new information available. So now I'll pass it off to Emily to walk through some of the other changes that were made to each labeling component in order to enable harmonization.
Great, thank you, Mark. So now we'll walk through the English harmonized labeling that we prepared for Avibela. In the countries where this labeling is used or will be used, Impact RH360 either is or will be the marketing authorization holder. While we'll be reviewing the English harmonized labeling in this webinar, we also have developed harmonized labeling in French and in Spanish. We plan to use the French harmonized labeling in Francophone countries such as Côte d'Ivoire, DRC, Mali, and Senegal. The first harmonized labeling component that you can see on the screen now is the pouch label, which is affixed to the primary packaging, the pouch. We removed the distributor information, the logos, and the local registration numbers. Next slide. For the patient information leaflet, we removed local distributor information, logos, and local contact information for pharmacovigilance or adverse event reporting. We replaced this information with guidance for the patient to contact their healthcare provider about side effects. Next slide. For the SMPC, we removed we removed local distributor information and local contact information for reporting of adverse events. In place of the local contact information, we added the new URL and QR code that Mark just discussed in an earlier slide. Next slide. And for the unit carton, which is the secondary packaging, we removed local distributor information and logos. We added local registration numbers for all countries in which this harmonized labeling is or will be used. Next slide. So now that the harmonized labeling for Avibela has been prepared, Impact RH360 is in the process of submitting post-approval variations to regulatory authorities in order to achieve approval of the new harmonized labeling in countries where Avibela is already approved. When possible, we combine the labeling change with other reportable changes in the variation. In November 2021, the French harmonized labeling for Avibela was approved by the regulatory authority in Madagascar. In March 2022, so just this month, the English harmonized labeling for Avibela was approved by the regulatory authority in Kenya. Later this year, we will also use the Spanish harmonized labeling for Avibela for the first time to fulfill an order placed by a Latin American country. Moving forward, new regulatory applications for Avibela will include harmonized labeling wherever possible. Now I'll pass it back to our moderator, Kate.
Great, thank you so much. I know that was a lot of information, but I hope that this was useful to everyone. And we've had some great comments and questions come in the chat. So I'm going to start looking through a few of those and we can discuss them. And if you haven't posted your chat or your question or comment, please do so, or raise your hand if you want to come off mute. So first, I'd like to read out a question that Megan Christofield from Japigo posted in regards to Wilberto's presentation. Wilberto, Megan writes, you mentioned that one use case for specialized non-harmonized labeling is for private sector distribution. And she writes, my understanding is that some people desire this so they can monitor product leakage from the public channels into the private sector. Is that right? And if so, are there other solutions to that challenge? And actually, Wilberto, before you respond, one thing I would just say is that overall, and I'll put the link in the chat, but some of you have seen that I've been posting links from the Hormonal IED Access group website portal. So we do have a website and there is a steering committee of the Hormonal IED Access group, and preventing leakage is something that that group takes very seriously, and we're discussing with both suppliers, Bayer and Medicines 360. So we're looking at that issue broadly across the board. And Wilberto, do you want to speak specifically to the issue of bullying as it relates to that?
Yeah. I just replied to the chat, and basically, I agree. You know, that's a huge problem, and essentially, based on the stakeholder meetings, interviews, we didn't collect any additional, controls or solutions for that in particular.
Thanks, Wilberto. Another question, Mark, came in. Thanks also to Megan for posting this. So just the idea of the QR code being really, really cool, and I agree. And so one question is that going to be realistic for most healthcare providers in low resource settings to access a QR code on their smartphone, et cetera. Has any due diligence been done around this, or is any planned? Thanks.
I'm not aware of any specific plan for diligence to address that question. I think it's an excellent question. In addition to the QR code, of course, we do also provide the URL or the actual website address as well. So it does not specifically require a smartphone. It can certainly be accessed by any internet connected computer as well. So I think we have kind of a broad coverage by enabling both smartphone and internet access to the information. And we're hoping that that's going to actually be work fairly well.
Yeah, and Mark, I would just add on to that when we were exploring the QR code option, we did reach out to our local distributors in country as well as other implementing partners to ask the same question about are QR codes, are they commonplace in these areas? Do you think that most providers would have access to smartphones to be able to read them? And we did get pretty unanimous feedback that is a really commonplace thing in these countries.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Mark. We have our hand raised by Lorraine. Lorraine, are you able to come off mute and maybe introduce yourself and ask your question or make a comment?
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Lorraine from UNFPA. And I would just like to find out, I'm actually, as you are presenting, first of all, great presentation. And I'm really grateful that we are working towards harmonizing the labeling requirements for our clients in the low middle income countries whom we service. I just wanted to find out from a UFPA point of view, when we approve, currently we have the Avibela in our LTA, and I'm just wondering now, if we are going to have different countries with different regulatory requirements, how would that then fit into what, for lack of a better word, UNFPA has approved to be distributed or made available to those respective countries? For example, let's just say for now, I think you've mentioned that currently it's Madagascar and Kenya that have somewhat are inclined to try to start using the QR codes. From our end as UNFPA, when we were doing the approval, that was not there. So now it becomes a change of specification from our end, because if maybe you're going to procure, whoever's going to procure this product for Madagascar, then the artworks, I'm assuming, would have to change from a manufacturer's point of view, which would be different to what we have already approved and have as a change, for lack of a better word, a change of specifications from our end. How are you going to add on to that when you are having different countries? As I say, from our end, we have approved a product and we service many countries. How are we going to manage whether it's a change of specification, it's just a notification to say, for this one, we are still using the local pharmacovigilance context, and for this one, we are not doing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. I can maybe provide an initial response, and then Emily, please let me know if you want to add anything. So I would say that, during discussions with UNFPA, our agreement was that we would provide product with labeling that has been approved by the local regulatory authority in each country. And so as the local regulatory authorities in the countries where Avibela is registered approve the implementation of the harmonized labeling, that is a labeling that we will use for orders of product for those countries. Obviously, we do not want to be providing product with labeling that has not been approved by the local regulatory authority.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Kelly. And as we're starting to roll this out into more countries, that then makes us able to provide product even faster than before. So certainly anytime that we are rolling out labeling in a country, we make sure that it is approved or at a minimum under an import waiver before doing that.
Sorry, okay, sorry, may I have a follow-up question to that?
Please go for it.
The reason why I'm asking is because I think at the bottom of the UNFPA questionnaire that you answer, you say that we are going to supply this product as is for the artworks and any other information that you have submitted to UNFPA. So I'm just trying to see how we're going to bridge that gap where we have received declaration that the product and the artworks that we have available at UNFPA is what you will be supplying to the respective countries, respecting that, yes, each and every country has their own requirements. I'm just trying to fit that gap because I as you were presenting, that's what I was asking myself, and I saw that as a gap as to maybe it's a conversation that we should take it out of this platform. However, that's the questions that I was asking myself, and I say, wait a minute, this is what was signed and agreed upon to say, this that which you have approved as UNFPA, this is what the supplier is going to receive as is, notwithstanding the fact that each country has its own regulatory authority and regulatory requirements. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. Definitely happy to take this discussion offline.
Yeah, thanks. This is a great conversation. And I just want to also point out, while not the focus of this call per se, there's been a lot of chat about the QR code. So a suggestion or a question from Megan about whether a QR code could be used for giving information, more, for example, around adverse events or other clinical guidelines. Another suggestion came in from Chris Masila that could a QR coding be linked also to GS1 standards for product tracking. So again, I think that this innovation, so to speak, is creating some good thinking. And just want to reiterate that I think that the product tracking issue is particularly important and the linkage issue. And again, just to reiterate that the Hormonal ID Access Group writ large is taking that issue very seriously and working with the suppliers on that. And if others want to join in, I know Morgan Simon, who's very involved with the Access Group, is very involved in that. So if others want to jump in on that, otherwise, and Kelly and Emily, I just wanted to see if you had any additional responses just to the comments so far.
I just had one additional response back to Megan's question about diversion of products from the public sector to the private sector and that concern. In addition to having specialized labeling, for the private sector available for purchasers, I think that we're also exploring the option of printing not for sale statements on product for the public sector when requested. And that's still being evaluated with the manufacturer, but the idea behind this is that that statement would not be included in the harmonized labeling, but would be printed sort of on top of that labeling. And so that's another option that we're considering, trying to address this question about product diversion while still maintaining harmonization of labeling.
Thanks, Kelly. And I love how we're sort of, bringing these two issues together because I do think that it's an important one. And again, also a comment from Ida about the use of QR codes potentially for regulatory documentation, she's saying. So again, maybe we're seeing an action item here from this webinar that we need to have a sidebar, perhaps through RHSC to further discuss that. All right, are there any other kind of big picture questions or comments? I think we've gone through most of the ones that have been submitted through the chat. For those who want to add anything else, please raise your hand. I can also, so Makul also has a question about the QR code. Welcome, Makul. Makul asks, has the use of QR codes been approved by the regulatory authorities? I think that we got into that a little bit, but maybe you can say a bit more on that.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So as we reviewed, we have gotten approval for the harmonized labeling, which integrates the QR code in a few countries at this point. As discussed here was Madagascar and Kenya. So those are the first two, and we're quite optimistic moving forward that this will be acceptable in other places where we already have product approval. So there's always the risks that there could be conversations with the regulatory authorities, that there would be some pushback, but we also have, I think, a strong case for why having that QR code brings us closer to having harmonized labeling, which really is a win-win for everybody.
Can I just ask a follow-on comment on this?
Yes,
Essentially, the challenge usually is that the control of the product is done at the time of importation. So most of the times, the regulatory authorities would control the labeling, and they would actually see the physical product and compare it to what's been approved. Now, in this case, the QR code is something which is virtual, and the control is in the hands of the manufacturer. So the challenge could be that, in case if there is a particular information which has been approved by the regulatory authority, and the change is being made by the manufacturer, which is not physically verified by the regulatory authority, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So far, that has not been raised as an issue by any regulatory authority.
Yeah,
But it's
yeah,
a good point.
and Emily, I would like to, if you mind, I would like to add that at the time of the import, as you mentioned, Mukul, the authority will review the label that matches with the registration, and in this case, the information that is being conserved for the QR code is the pharmacovigilance contact information. So that's something that will be standard and can be easily confirmed. Obviously, there are more information that can be added to a QR code down the road, but if that at that point, definitely it could be something that that need to be well thought and presented to the authority. But as Emily said, nothing so far we have found.
Thanks.
great, thanks. And we have a hand raised from Ida. Ida, can you come off mute and introduce yourself? Maybe ask a question.
Ida, you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Thank you. I'm Ida Cancel. I work at FHI 360 in the Product Quality and Compliance Department and on regulatory and compliance. And I also manage the GHSA QA project, the regulatory compliance section. And so I'm talking here on my personal interest, not necessarily on GHSA QA. And I do understand that QR code can become a topic in its own, but I just wanted to really address probably Mukul's comment from a regulatory perspective. When you're talking about what are the indications, the use, et cetera, of a product, putting it into a website with a QR code, you lose all of that regulatory controls. The website is managed by you, the website, who knows how it's updated and what people are going to be in. So that's why I would like to continue the conversation QR codes, because I am seeing it. And I don't think that all the regulatory authorities are on board. And for me, like Lorraine, reviewing from a GHSE QA perspective makes it very, very challenging. However, in this case, the QR code is not used to provide regulatory information, it's to provide a link for a report. And so I think that in this case, that's why and it does not necessarily affect the labeling, because you still have the manufacturer information that you can always access through the primary packaging that you can report, should you need to. And so I would be looking at those things when I'm reviewing the labeling for certain documents for approval for procurement. So I hope that this information is helpful to you guys.
Thanks, Ida. Any additional reactions or comments from the panelists? Okay, well, any final questions or comments from the participants, please raise your hand or quickly put it in the chat. I'll just say as we wrap up and maybe give people a few minutes back of their day, that I just really want to thank the team for this assessment. Again, obviously this relates to a specific product, but we really wanted to share this with the global community because I hope as been reflected in the conversation, I think there are a lot of relevant learnings that can be applied to other FP, SRH products, but then also additional global health products more broadly. So again, hoping that these findings have been relevant to multiple audiences in the room. You will see that in the chat, I've put links to a blog that Kelly wrote with some a good summary of the assessment process and key findings. There's also a final report available on the Hormonal IED Access portal, and the link is there in the chat as well. Just finally, we do have an e-newsletter. If you're interested in the hormonal IUD specifically, there's a wealth of information on the website, including in the resource library, including other regulatory materials, training materials, etc. And we do have a global newsletter that goes out about quarterly. So if you don't receive that and want to receive that, you can sign up there. Otherwise, unless there's anything final, Sophia, if you want to jump in from RHSC, I really want to again thank the panelists and the team for this great work, and also RHSC for co-sponsoring the event, as well as the Hormonal IED Access Group, of course, and the Contraceptive Technology Innovation Exchange. So maybe Sophia, I'll hand it over to you, and also maybe you can just confirm, I think we'll be sharing the recording from this event and can also send out the materials via the listservs.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kate. And thanks to all for presenting such an informative presentation, and to all of you for your thought-provoking comments and questions as well. As Kate mentioned, in the coming days, we will share the webinar recording as well as the presentations, and locate those also on our website for future reference. Thanks so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.